Hello, hello. I am Sinner, and I am back with another video. Today I am reviewing What is Property by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Proudhon. Translated by Benjamin R. Tucker, some American anarchist. Now, this is the second book I've read by an anarchist, the first one being Democracy, the God That Failed by Hopper. And obviously, there's a big difference, right? Hopper is an anarcho-capitalist, and Proudhon is an anarcho-socialist, and he's also the first person to call himself an anarchist. And he's pretty interesting. I thought that the book was um, fairly unique. I'm sort of going through a phase of trying to challenge myself by reading, you know, books that I know I won't agree with, um, and this is one of them. Anarchism is generally something that I think everyone intuitively, when they first hear about it, think, oh, that doesn't make sense, that's weird. But I think if you actually take the time to understand it, I wouldn't say I agree with it. I think there's major problems with it, but it's more intellectual and it's more reasonable than what initially meets the eye. Um, and I've realized the pattern now that I've read two, and I've started reading a third, which is The Conquest of Bread. And the pattern is this: every anarchist is focused on rights. It's always about rights and logical extrapolation of rights and like sort of deontological morality to its logical extreme. I think if you're a liberal, now I especially think this, if you're a liberal, and you believe in rights, you're sort of like a Menshevik. You're not actually going all the way to anarchism, which is its logical conclusion. If you believe in property rights or or the right not to be coerced or something like this, the right to liberty or something like this, to the right to work, you know, the right not to be coerced against your will, these sorts of things. It's basically impossible to believe in the state. Now, that being said, I would say that not everyone, like morally speaking, I would say that I'm not someone who believes in rights as this sort of like metaphysical category where people have these like inalienable characteristics that make them like, you know, it's just objectively always wrong to do this. And I think that's the strength and weakness that anarchism seems to hinge on. You know, so for example, with property rights or any sort of rights, um, let's take the the right to the right to life, right? Um, you're always in this situation where, like, morally speaking, you can't infringe on anyone else's rights. But that's like kind of true. But like, if you think about it for 2 seconds, you're in this situation where someone can just infringe on your rights, but you're morally not allowed to infringe on theirs. It's like a suicidal pacifism. Or, and I think intuitively everyone would understand that that's immoral for you to just like let someone do something to you. But then they might say, oh, well, you have your own right to life, and then it's like blah blah blah. They always have to like invent a lot of mental gymnastics around it. Um, like another example, which I would use, is like let's say this one won't really it would kind of work for Proudhon, but it wouldn't work for Kropotkin. This line of argumentation I'm about to use. But let's say you're a grocer, right? You run a grocery store, and that's your job. And as a grocer, you have, I don't know, bread, right? Or cabbage. Let's say you have cabbage. And some guy comes into your your house or your shop, you know, and they steal the cabbage, right? From a rights-based perspective, that starving man is in the wrong because he's stolen something. He's stolen your possession. But from I think a more teleological moral perspective, you would say it's okay for that man to steal the bread or the cabbage or whatever because it's, preserving his life. And that sort of dynamic, I think, is something that really has to be addressed if you want to like take anarchism seriously, which is that you have these objective sort of, but at the same time hyper rigid binary rules. And the moment you start saying stuff like, okay, well, this right's more important than that right, or like, actually it kind of doesn't, you know, you can ignore rights in these particular circumstances, then they lose that characteristic of being like these inalienable metaphysical categories and just become like vibes. It's like it's a rule you kind of follow, and then it stops being really anarchism. You know what I mean? It starts just being egoism, kind of thing. But anyway, do I agree with the that with what he's saying? Not really, but I will say this. Um, if you take the logic of the right to work, the right to life, and the right to liberty and all these sorts of things seriously, then you do come into um, conflict when you have property rights because you are necessarily, and by property rights, it's very specific. It's like absentee ownership. It's not just, you know, you live in your house that you live in and like that's your house. It's more like the type of rent-seeking, exploitative use of property rights where it's like, I own property. I've never lived in this house that's 100 kilometers away, but I still get $300 a month, or that's really low these days, like $500 a week, $600 a week, $700 a week from this house because, yeah, it's my property. I can pay this random family that I've never actually done anything for, provide no services to. I can force them to pay me $600 a week because it's my property. I just get to do that. It's like there is a point where you kind of have to be like, that's just exploitative, it's rent seeking, and it's immoral. And I think that's true. I would say there is a point where it's like when you're price gouging someone's life, there's no other way to look at it than theft. Um, and I think there's something to that, but I don't really agree in the idea that like absentee ownership has zero social value. And also because again, and this is what I've said before, because I don't believe in like rights as like these metaphysical categories that just exist, I don't really think like, oh well, it's property rights don't exist because they contradict other rights, which is his thesis. That's what he's trying to say. It's like, no, all rights don't exist. So property rights also don't exist, but neither does the right to life. Like, it doesn't work like that. Not that living's bad or anything. I don't think that. But yeah, it's a really interesting book, and I think it does go into exploitation. And um, you know, you have to look at things from like, and this is something which is really important to note, and I think this is something that socialists generally are better at identifying. It's like capitalists or like pro-capitalism people are like uber. They have to play this game where they pretend that everything's fine and that there's nothing wrong with capitalism, um, and that like there's never exploitation. But then on this, especially once you get into like more hardcore communist stuff, it's like it's always exploitation. Um, and there's like a little bit of truth with both of them, but I think especially Proudhon in this book, he does point out a lot of what you could call like the informal exploitation, or like the informal robberies, the informal schemes. Like as a basic example, you know, sorry, my throat's dry. Um, with like a basic example, let's say, you know, I have a shop. We'll talk about price wars, I think is what they called. Um, if I have a shop that sells potatoes and two other people have a shop that sells potatoes, right? And everyone deliberately lowers their prices to put me out of business, then that is, in its own way, like an act of theft, right? It's a scheme and a trick to make me destitute, which is like inherently conniving and base and like low. And there's something about that that's like gross. And it's the same thing with overcharging something. There's such a thing as a just price. The idea that like, yeah, this ticket for this, I don't know, this concert, this is something that happens a lot, right? This ticket for this concert, it did sell for $50, but I bought all the tickets, and now you have to pay $300 for it. It's like that's unfair. That is not just. It's a form of usury, as some might say. The idea of like using this trickery to steal wealth and to like siphon people's wealth when you don't deserve it. There's something about that I think a lot of socialists get right. That a lot of the time these companies, and also nowadays the state as well, um, a lot of everything we see is rent seeking and price gouging, you know, um, and it hurts like small businesses a lot, which is kind of sad. It's like, oh, well, you want to set up a bakery? Well, you're going to have to pay this much in tax, and you're going to have to pay this much in getting through all the red tape, and you're going to have to pay this much in like all the time you waste filling out all the paperwork that we need you to fill out. Oh, and you're going to have to pay for this license and that license and that license. It gets to a point where it's just a form of robbery. And that's what property is, and that's what the state does sometimes. Oh my gosh. Whew. Drink some water. Oh, I'm out of water. Bruh. But yeah, I think there is a lot of like truth to that there's that like theft in in scheming for wealth rather than honest wealth. Honest earning of wealth by providing things versus using tricks to get it. And that's something that you can take away from this without actually having to agree with anarchism, I would say. And it is kind of interesting how he goes through at the end of his first memoir, like the why communism just doesn't work. And I thought that was interesting. Um, because, a lot of the time, what you find with these sorts of like modern discourse is that everything's on like that binary, and you'll have like, I don't know, it was sort of weird. Every time I hear anarchism or like anarchists talk, they're either ANCAPs or ANCOMs. You never really see like a middle ground. So it was kind of interesting in that sense. Um, but yeah, I think even if you're not an anarchist, you should totally read Proudhon. The second memoir, which was the other half, like he wrote two memoirs. The first one was like his thesis, and then the second one was a reply to someone who criticized his book. The second one was kind of mid. I don't think you need to read it. If you want to like skim through it, just read the first uh, chapter, like the first few chapters in the fifth chapter, and then call it a day. And you'll get everything you need. But yeah, it is interesting. This is another thing I'll say. Two other things I'll say. One, he falls into the trap of like, you know, this is, I don't know what it is about people from the 1800s. They love doing this. And from like between like the 1500s and like the 1900s, everyone does this for some reason. They will like create like a fan fiction of like what the ancient past was like what primitive humanity was like. They'll either say it was like a utopia and it just so happens to be their ideology, or they'll say it's like literal hell on earth, which would be the opposite of their ideology. And then they're like, okay, so we need to not do that, or we need to do that. So he kind of falls into that trap where he's like, back in the day, there was no property and things were awesome, but now we have property and it sucks. And it's like, okay, it was absentee ownership has been a thing since forever, realistically. But he doesn't, he does concede like since civilization, that's been a thing. So yeah. But the what was the other thing I was gonna say? I forget. I forget. I'm tired. I just came back from a lot of 2 weeks of hard work, and yeah, I'm Sinner. I think I've said everything I need to say, or I wanted to say about this book. Oh, this is the other thing I wanted to say, which is that he does make a lot of interesting historical arguments. Um, and I think he does point out something which is true, which is that when property, and this is productive property, like wealth making property, is widely distributed, society is more balanced, society is more stable and less exploitative. And I think there is something true to that because one of the things that I think we've sort of lost in the last 100 years is the fact that you can only get what you want by leveraging, you know, against other people, right? So you can't just have what you want. You need to be able to like motivate them to give you what you want or to not take from you. You can't just, you know, just have rights. You can't just have privileges. Um, and if you have a society where everyone is able to independently generate wealth, no one's dependent on each other as much, which makes it harder to exploit people. And that's what, and it's sort of, in a weird way, it echoes kind of some of the things de Juvenel said about like the aristocratic oligarchy class, where no one is, everyone's equal because no one can force anyone to do anything. It's sort of interesting how you see that pattern. Um, the other thing I wanted to talk about is that his prediction about the future was just wrong. He predicted in the future that property would, maybe in the next 50 to 100 years no longer exist because it was a contradiction and um, like he thought that property would sort of snowball into like a mass starvation or mass inefficiency, and that would lead to people abolishing it in a revolution, which never happened. 100, 200 years later, hasn't happened. So he got that wrong. But yeah, that is another argument anarchists make, which is interesting. The idler argument that the proprietors are idlers. I'd say that there's one purpose that capitalists or merchants or whatever you want to call them have in society. They have a social utility, which is the allocation of capital, the allocation of wealth. So that might seem strange, but it's like this is the thing which I believe in, honestly. We don't live in like a, a an unplanned economy. We live in a planned economy. But the difference is it's a decentrally planned economy, unlike the Soviet system, which was a centrally planned economy. We just have an oligarchy of billionaires who plan how the money's spent, rather than like a government organization plan how the money's spent. So that is the social utility of having people with lots of wealth, is that they can decide and plan for the future with how money should be spent in anticipation of ideally more efficient systems appearing in in the future. But like even that argument's a bit dubious. I don't really fully buy into that argument. But you know, you got to play with these ideas in your head. You got to be like you got to be able to pretend to be a capitalist and a socialist in your head and then argue against yourself if you want to like think about things more seriously. But yeah, it's an interesting idea, the idea of like a class of idlers would make society less efficient. I don't know how much it's true. I mean, like there's always going to be idlers. Um, Now, and obviously you need the ratio of idlers to working people to be in balance, but whether the capitalist class is going to inevitably break that balance, I don't know. But yeah, it's something. Um, I think I've babbled on for long enough. I am Sinner. Um, Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Please like and subscribe. Bye bye.